And I certainly would like to see him come in the month of January to before the Congress, and so that people's representatives will have an opportunity to ask him questions.
The other question that's out there following reporting from CNN last week that Robert Mueller was still interested in securing an interview with President Trump and having him answer questions in person, despite those written answers to questions from the special counsel that were submitted last month, is whether the president would actually sit down for an interview. Rudy Giuliani was asked about that on Sunday, and he sort of joked about it. Listen to this.
Here's the special counsel. Does he want to interview the president?
Yeah, good luck. Good luck. After what they did to Flynn, the way they trapped him into perjury, and no sentence for him, 14 days for Papadopoulos, I did better on traffic violations than they did with Papadopoulos.
So when you say good luck, you're saying no way, no interview.
They're a joke over my dead body, but, you know, I could be dead.
In a separate interview, Giuliani struck a bit more of a serious tone, saying that he wouldn't comment on that CNN reporting, though he did say that there is an agreement out there between the president's attorneys and the special counsel that allows for more time and discussion over whether the president will answer more questions that may come from the special counsel. Boris Sanchez, CNN at the White House.
Boris, thank you very much. Now let's bring in Scott Lucas to talk more about this. Scott, a professor of international politics at the University of Birmingham in England, also the founder and editor of EA Worldview, via Skype this hour with us in Birmingham, England. A pleasure, Scott, always to have you.
Thank you, George.
We have heard from Mr. Trump's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, speaking about whether the president should sit down for an interview with the special counsel, Robert Mueller. Giuliani now saying over his dead body in one interview on Fox News, you'll remember the president has said before he would be open to sitting down, though he worries about the possibility of being set up in a trap. So is this possibility a door that has been effectively shut from your view?
Well, certainly the White House are going to man the barricades. And let's be honest here, it's because they fear that in a face-to-face encounter where you can't control statements, Donald Trump could leave himself open to perjury. On the other side, I think Robert Mueller's team see this as the final point where they want to bring everything together, lay it out before the president. If we do not have Trump sitting down with Mueller face-to-face, then I think it is a question of when the Mueller team proceeds anyway to lay out the full extent of what they have across a number of fronts. I think that might be in the spring. It could be a bit later. But let's be clear here. That impending investigation is reducing Donald Trump to a cross between Jimmy Cagney, you dirty rats, and King Lear, with Rudy Giuliani playing the court jester. We're not just talking about one investigation here, George. Please remember that Michael Cohen and the link of Donald Trump to criminal activity by prosecutors did not come over Russia. It came over the payoffs to women. New York State is investigating the Trump Organization. It was reported in the last week that the Trump Inaugural Committee is under investigation. When you talk about Russia, it's not just the political investigation now, it's the investigation that is linked back to Trump's business with the claim of the pursuit of the Trump Tower in Moscow. So when it's multiple investigations, it's much harder for Trump to get control of the narrative back. And I think this is just going to spiral down and down till, like I say, within the next 6 months, we have the final act.
Let's speak more about Rudy Giuliani. We heard him drop a bombshell about the Trump Tower Moscow project, admitting now that the talks could have continued until shortly before the U.S. presidential election. How does this play into the president's poll numbers? Let's bring those into view to show our viewers in the U.S. and around the world what we're seeing at this point. The president's poll numbers at this point, 43% approve, 54% disapprove. How does it play into that?
Well, those numbers have been pretty much the same, George, since early this year, because I think for two reasons. One is I think people can't comprehend the scope of what is happening. And two, because even though Rudy Giuliani, don't rule this out, when he makes statements like the Trump Tower talks could have gone until November 2016, he might not be admitting something. He might just be confused. But that confusion, not only from Giuliani, but from Trump, from the White House, sometimes deliberate, sometimes unintentional, means that people don't actually know where we are. So if you're with Trump, you shrug your shoulders and say, we're still with him. If you're against Trump, you're still against him, but you just keep wondering when we're finally going to get clarity.
So all politicians, Scott, can say one thing at one time, pivot politically for reasons, or evolve later. But there is a difference from simply bending the truth or lying. And you can't deny that this president has been caught telling a tale or two, or more than 6,000 tales since taking office, according to the Washington Post reporting. What do you make of these latest poll numbers? The NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, if we can bring that up into view, showing many Americans believe the president is not telling the truth about the Russia investigation.
Well, what's striking, George, is, and let's be clear, first of all, Donald Trump lies. I mean, I'm not going to use false statements, distortion. I'm going to tell you Donald Trump lies. But what's interesting about the poll numbers now is that a higher percentage of Americans now believe that Donald Trump is lying, for example, about the Russia investigation, than actually oppose Donald Trump. That means that some people who still are amongst that 43% who back him are effectively saying, even though we think Donald Trump is lying, we're still going to stand by him. Now, there may be multiple reasons for that. I won't go into that now. But what it means is that's what makes the task of Robert Mueller even harder, that even putting out the truth, the reality in evidence, evidence from witnesses, evidence from computer files, evidence from documents, even presenting that truth may not be enough to swing the Trump supporter who says, well, you know what? If he lied a few times, hey, so what?
Some Americans are against the lies and some are okay with it. We'll just have to, of course, see what is in store for the next year. Scott Lucas, live for us in Birmingham, England. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, George.
Now to Saudi Arabia, denouncing the U.S. Senate after lawmakers voted to end U.S. military support for the war in Yemen. They also voted to condemn the Saudi crown prince in the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. That move from the Senate, also a rebuke of the U.S. president, who continues to support the Saudi kingdom. Saudi Arabia's Foreign Affairs Ministry issued this statement. I'll read it here. The recent position of the United States Senate, which has been built on baseless allegations and accusations, includes blatant interference in its internal affairs and the role of the kingdom at the regional and international level. In a few hours' time, the British Prime Minister will bring her latest Brexit argument to Parliament. Coming up, the growing push for a second referendum. Also, George Howell, the British Prime Minister, is set to speak out against a second Brexit referendum on Monday in the House of Commons. It comes as Theresa May is slamming one of her predecessors over his support and comments of a second vote. Ms. May accusing Tony Blair of undermining her negotiations on the divorce deal from the EU by advocating for a second vote. But Blair says it isn't irresponsible or insulting to look for an alternative way forward. Theresa May's chief of staff was forced to deny that he was planning for a second referendum. That report again came from the Sunday Times. It says some of the prime minister's senior allies are getting ready for a second vote. Let's bring in Stephen Erlinger to talk more about this. Stephen, the chief diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times in Europe, live this hour from Brussels, Belgium. Stephen, a pleasure.
Thanks, George.
Look, there's been this growing chorus of people just getting a bit louder about this possibility of a second referendum, all brought to a head by Theresa May's predecessor, Tony Blair, who went to Brussels to suggest that a second referendum is more likely now. Theresa May accusing Blair of undermining the negotiations. What do you make of this idea, though, of this second referendum? Does it seem that she has the political capital to stop it?
Well, she's certainly trying to. I mean, her whole strategy is my deal or no deal, right? My way or the highway. And the problem is there is no majority in Parliament for her deal. Unfortunately, there's no majority in Parliament for any deal, but there does seem to be a majority in Parliament not to crash out of the European Union on March 29th. So some people, like Blair, and it could happen, would want Parliament to take over control of the process and vote, despite the government's desires, for a second referendum. Now, there are lots of reasons why that would be complicated, why it would require delay. What kind of questions would you ask? Would it be fair? Who would get to vote, et cetera, et cetera? But if Parliament can't decide, the whole idea of punting it back to the people to let them decide again is getting more traction, but it is not what Mrs. May wants.
Stephen, we were talking about this in the newsroom, just the different options around Brexit. And the question here, as we get closer to March and the day the UK exits the EU, is this a matter of Theresa May effectively running down the clock? The closer we get to that date, does it put more pressure on MPs to either make their peace with this deal or be responsible for possibly leading to a hard Brexit with no deal?
Well, that seems to be her strategy. I mean, it's been terribly mismanaged, I have to say. But at this point, her argument is, you know, it's a very complicated deal. I've done my best with the red lines that I've had. It's not going to get any better. So either, you know, let's accept it and work on what really matters, which is true, is negotiating a future relationship with the EU over the next 20 months, because after all, even after March 29th, nothing will change for 20 months. There's a standstill deal. So to some degree, her strategy is a bit like Muhammad Ali's used to be, which is like rope-a-dope, which is you lie back against the ropes and protect yourself and let people exhaust themselves by swinging at you, but you don't fall down.
Stephen.
That's Theresa May.
I don't mean to laugh. Rope-a-dope. I've never heard that analogy brought into Brexit, but I guess it makes sense here. One other question I'd like to ask you about Jeremy Corbyn, seeming to stay out of the fray lately, but feeling the pressure to back a vote of no confidence or even putting a second referendum back to the people for a vote.
Well, Jeremy Corbyn's in this strange position because he's actually a Brexiter. He didn't campaign much for Remain. His whole desire is to pull down the government. It's a very weak government. It's a government completely divided amongst itself. That's what you're hearing. You have every cabinet minister moving now to maneuver to succeed Theresa May, who's already promised to step down before the next election. And then you have Jeremy Corbyn, who is very popular with the young, but doesn't have enough support to really yet win an election. He should be, but the Labour opposition, given the mess in the Tory party, should be way ahead, and it isn't. So he's being pushed to ask for a vote of no confidence. The problem is it's unlikely that he would win it because the Tories don't want a new election. And if there is a new election, he may not win that either. So he's a bit stuck. He's trying to say no to everything, to undermine the government. And at the same time, I think in his heart of hearts, he knows the timing isn't right for the Labour Party.
Stephen Erlanger, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time and perspective.
Thanks, George.
The Washington Post has obtained a draft of a report that's been prepared for the U.S. Senate about Russia's interference in the 2016 election. It describes it as the most sweeping analysis yet of Russia's disinformation campaign. The report studied millions of social media posts provided by technology firms, and here's what it found: that Russia used every major social media platform to help elect Mr. Trump. That's all Moscow's messaging was intended to benefit the Republican Party, and that on Facebook alone, Russia's campaign reached 126 million people. Washington Post reporter Craig Timberg worked on that report, and he discussed it earlier with my colleague Brian Stelter and Ana Cabrera.
This in many ways is the report we've been waiting for. It's sweeping, it's comprehensive, it uses the fullest data set we've seen yet from the companies who turned over lots of information to the government that they didn't turn over to anybody else. And so it doesn't exactly tell us things we didn't suspect or haven't heard, but it puts it all together in a new way, and it's very comprehensive and compelling. I feel like they kind of reverse engineered the entire Russian disinformation campaign in this one report.
The very issue of election meddling by Russia, it is just one dark cloud hanging over the U.S. president. But for his jailed associates, it is a very different story. The case in point, his former attorney, Michael Cohen. CNN's Brian Todd has a look at Mr. Trump's shifting account of his one-time fixer.
President Trump's hush money payments to Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal may once have seemed embarrassing personally, but now they may threaten to harm him legally. Experts say that may be why the president's story keeps changing, going from "I didn't know" to "it's not my fault" to "it's not illegal."
2 weeks.
In a new interview with ABC, Trump's former lawyer, Michael Cohen, says Trump absolutely directed him to make the payments to Daniels and McDougal, and did it with a specific purpose in mind, winning the presidency.
He was very concerned about how this would affect the election.
To help his campaign.
To help him and the campaign.
That, experts say, would be a violation of campaign finance law, which may be why the president is now blaming his lawyer for bad advice, tweeting Thursday morning, "I never directed Michael Cohen to break the law. He was a lawyer and he is supposed to know the law." But that argument hardly lasted half a day, because just hours after tweeting that, Trump told Fox News Cohen barely did legal work for him.
That was his title.
He did very low-level work.
Why did you need him?
He did more public relations than he did law.
But back in April, the president had a different view of Cohen on Air Force One when he denied ever knowing about the Stormy Daniels payment.
Did you know about the $130,000 payment to Stormy Daniels?
No.
Why did Michael Cohen make it if there was no truth to your allegation?
Well, you have to ask Michael Cohen. Michael's an attorney, and you'll have to ask Michael.
In August, his story changed again when Trump was asked by, yes, another Fox News anchor if he knew about the payments.
Later on, I knew. Later on. But you have to understand, Ainsley, what he did, and they weren't taken out of campaign finance.
Experts say that argument may not hold water, especially because the president, according to a source, was at a meeting in August of 2015 discussing hush money payments with Cohen and David Pecker, the CEO of the National Enquirer's parent company. Does it give him an out to say that I knew about it later?
No, it doesn't give him an out. They knew about it later. Once he knew about it, he was party to the violation.
Another shift in the story comes from Trump's legal advisor, Rudy Giuliani. On May 2nd, Giuliani told Fox that Cohen, who had taken out a personal home equity line to pay for Stormy Daniels' silence, was paid back by Trump.
The president reimbursed that.
The reimbursement comment, is that an admission that Trump knew about the payments earlier?
Yes, that's an admission that he knew about it earlier. Why would Trump be reimbursing him if he didn't know about the payments?
It's going to turn out.
In that same interview, Giuliani suggested that paying Cohen back meant Trump hadn't violated campaign finance laws.
That money was not campaign money. Sorry, I'm giving you a fact now that you don't know. It's not campaign money. No campaign finance violation. So
they funneled it through the law firm.
Funneled through a law firm, and the president repaid it.
Experts say the repayment of Cohen, which prosecutors now say came in the form of fake retainer payments to him by the Trump organization, still means there were probably campaign finance violations and may have violated other laws too. That may be why Trump suggested another version of the story on Thursday, when he denied paying back media conglomerate AMI, that parent company of the National Enquirer, for its role in hush money payments to McDougal.
I don't think they even paid any money to that tabloid, okay? I don't think we made a payment to that tabloid.
By not paying them back, you have a straight-out corporate contribution to the campaign.
In fact, it may make it worse, all of which experts say begs the question, are all these shifting stories taken as a whole a crime?
To support the idea that he has committed crimes, whether it is the knowing and willful violation because he's trying to hide it, showing he knows there's something wrong here. And it also can be an element of obstruction of justice if he's trying to influence other witnesses, if he's trying to influence the jury with lies.
But experts caution that there's also the possibility that all these shifting stories in totality may not prove obstruction of justice, simply because we don't know everything that Trump and his legal team have told to prosecutors. And they say that Trump and his team could make the case that the president was confused about the law, confused about what obstruction really means, even though he's always had lawyers to tell him that. Brian Todd, CNN, Washington.
Brian, thank you for the report. It seems the president's new pick for White House chief of staff can't keep his story straight either, specifically on whether he actually likes the U.S. president. Here's what Mick Mulvaney said just a couple of years ago, this video obtained by the Daily Beast. Listen.
Yes, I'm supporting Donald Trump. I'm doing so as enthusiastically as I can, given the fact I think he's a terrible human being, but the choice on the other side is just as bad.
Mulvaney currently heads up the Office of Management and Budget. A spokeswoman for that office released this statement that provides some context. This is old news, it says. These comments were made in 2016 when he was a congressman and had yet to meet the president. It's a move drawing condemnation from around the world. China ordering the arrest of 100 Christians. We'll have the very latest on the developments from Beijing. A prominent pastor is calling China's moves against Christians a wicked, unlawful action. Wang Yi is one of 100 Christians who were taken into custody last week. Western governments and civil rights advocates are condemning Beijing for its mass arrest of a religious community. It's just the latest move in China's stepped-up crackdown on independent religious practice. CNN's Stephen Zhang is following the story, our senior producer there in Beijing. And Stephen, tell us more about what compelled the Chinese government to crack down on these Christians.
Well, George, particularly this very, very prominent pastor, Wang Yi, because he is an unusually vocal and blunt critic of the government. Unlike many of his peers, Pastor Wang is known to give very fiery and really passionate sermons to his more than 500 followers in this early Rain Covenant Church in the southwestern Chinese city of Chengdu. He never shies away from politically sensitive topics. He really speaks against what he perceives as social ills and wrong-headed government policies, criticizing even this country's increasingly powerful leader, Xi Jinping. For example, when Mr. Xi oversaw the removal of presidential term limits early this year, basically paving the way for him to rule the country indefinitely, Pastor Wang spoke against that. So that definitely didn't sit well with the government. As you mentioned, after his arrest, his supporters posted several of his writings, examples online, including one that basically in which he foresaw his upcoming arrest. But he says he's prepared to face whatever the government is going to throw at him. And he also says his followers should really continue to engage in civil disobedience.
George. We're talking about Christians. In this case, Muslims also have been in question here. Tell us more about the larger issue, Stephen, about religious crackdown across China.
That's right. This is really the latest example of that very disturbing broader trend of the government's increasingly harsh crackdown on all religions, but especially Christianity and Islam, the two religions the authorities here deem most prone to foreign influences. Now, under President Xi Jinping, he has really, I think, increasingly considered these religions part of the Western plot against China. That's why he is, ever since he took power, you see a lot more evidence of this kind of crackdown, including, for example, the demolition of longtime churches or the forcible removal of hundreds, if not thousands, of crosses atop of church structures. And early this year, the authorities also banned the online sale of the Bible. All these are really part of this larger story when the government is trying to crack down on any organization with organizational capacity to potentially challenge the Communist Party's monopoly on power. And just to give you a bit of context, the government here is atheist, and they only recognize 5 religions. And followers of these religions have to really practice and worship in government-sanctioned places only. And this church of Pastor Wang's is not part of that government-sanctioned system. That's why the government considers his religion illegal, and the followers have been practicing their religion